For nearly 5 decades, Evelyn Matthews stood faithfully beside her husband, Benjamin, a well-respected historian known across New England for his books and lectures. They had built a life together in a quiet colonial-style home in Vermont, raising their daughter, Hannah, and upholding the image of a picture-perfect family. To the outside world, Evelyn was simply the wife, the quiet woman who organized Benjamin's lectures, served coffee at alumni events, and raised their daughter while he built his legacy. She had no college degree, no career of her own. Her identity was wrapped entirely around being a supportive spouse. So when, at age 72, Benjamin suddenly requested a divorce to reunite with his widowed first love, Margaret, a poet he'd reconnected with online, Evelyn's world shattered. The announcement came with cold efficiency. "Margaret needs me now. I want to spend my final years with her." Their daughter Hannah, now a tenured professor herself, not only supported the decision, she celebrated it. Within weeks, Benjamin and Margaret's wedding photos flooded social media, going viral for their once-lost love finally fulfilled narrative. Evelyn, humiliated and discarded, wasn't even mentioned. But Evelyn wasn't done yet, and she was about to remind them all. She was never just the wife. The day of Benjamin and Margaret's wedding was unseasonably warm for early October. The leaves in Vermont had just begun to turn, painting the landscape in brilliant hues of amber and crimson. The wedding was held at a grand inn in Stowe, with antique chandeliers, string quartets, and a guest list that read like a who's who of academia. Evelyn hadn't been invited, of course. But she showed up anyway. Not with fury, but with clarity. She wore a navy blue dress, simple but elegant, and a strand of pearls Benjamin had gifted her on their 25th anniversary. Back when promises still meant something. As she stepped into the reception hall, conversations hushed. All eyes turned toward her, their surprise slowly morphing into discomfort. At the center of the room stood Benjamin, looking years younger in a perfectly tailored gray suit. The same one Evelyn had once sewn a lucky charm into. Margaret clung to his arm in a lace gown, glowing beneath the soft candlelight. Benjamin's jaw tightened the moment he saw Evelyn. He took a step forward, Margaret in tow, and said with a brittle smile, "Evelyn, please. Don't ruin this. Let's part on good terms." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "I'm not here to ruin anything," she said evenly. "I'm just here to return something that was never truly mine." Before anyone could respond, Hannah appeared, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Mom, what are you doing here?" she whispered sharply, tugging at Evelyn's arm. "Please don't make a scene. This is Dad's day. Aunt Margaret has waited her whole life for this." "Aunt Margaret," Evelyn said with a dry laugh. "Since when did the woman your father snuck off to play chess with become your aunt?" Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret's smile faltered. Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo. An old, faded image of her and Benjamin on their wedding day, young and hopeful. "Does anyone here remember this man? Because I lived beside him for nearly 50 years, and I'm starting to think he forgot me long before he left." She turned to the crowd. "You all came to celebrate a romantic reunion. A scholar and a poet finally finding their way back to each other. But let me tell you something. While he was writing books and teaching seminars, I was cooking, cleaning, raising our daughter, and keeping our life afloat." Benjamin opened his mouth to speak, but Evelyn raised a hand. "No," she said. "Not this time." Then, with quiet poise, she reached into her bag again, and held up a neatly sealed envelope, her own version of closure. "These are revised divorce papers," she said, her voice unwavering. "They include the real story. Not your fairy tale." Without waiting for a response, Evelyn turned and walked out. Her heels echoing against the polished floor, each step a declaration I will not be erased. Evelyn hadn't planned on doing anything more than delivering those papers. She thought she'd walk out of that opulent inn and never look back. But life had a cruel way of delivering one last blow, just when you thought you were done bleeding. 3 days later, her phone buzzed. Hannah had posted a family photo. In it, Margaret stood beside Benjamin, her hand resting gently on his chest. Hannah leaned into her, both women beaming. The caption read, "Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about finally finding the people who complete you." There was no mention of Evelyn, no acknowledgement of the woman who had sacrificed everything so this family could even exist. The comments were brutal. Finally, Benjamin found someone on his level. She must have been such a burden all those years. No, this is a real love story. That night, Evelyn sat alone at her kitchen table. In front of her were bills, photos, and her old, worn wedding album. Pages frayed from years of handling, she hadn't opened it in over a decade. Now, each image was a mockery of the promises made. The promises broken. Then, a knock. She opened the door to find a man in his late 30s, neatly dressed, holding a folder. "Mrs. Matthews." "Yes. My name is David Klein. I was Professor Benjamin's teaching assistant for 2 years. I know I probably shouldn't be here, but I saw what's happening online, and there's something you need to know." Evelyn furrowed her brow, cautiously stepping aside to let him in. David opened the folder. Inside were copies of emails, some dating back over 10 years, correspondences between Benjamin and Margaret. Intimate, emotional, and explicit. All while he was still married. Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs. This wasn't some rekindled fairy tale. David said gently. They never stopped. Margaret used to visit his office after hours. I saw them together, often. He even had me deliver gifts to her. Under the guise of professional courtesy. I didn't realize what it was until much later. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. Evelyn's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Each message was a dagger, but within the pain bloomed something else. Vindication. She had spent decades being gaslit, dismissed, ignored. But now, she held proof. With David's blessing, she published a short video the next day. It wasn't emotional or dramatic. Just a quiet woman, calmly telling the truth. I was the wife who raised the daughter, kept the house, and was called a burden. But here are the facts. She included screenshots, dates, receipts, years of deception, and once again, the internet exploded, but this time, in her favor. She deserves everything. Forget fairy tale. This was an affair dressed up in vintage lace. Someone give this woman a TED Talk. Evelyn didn't smile. Not yet. But when she closed her laptop that night, she didn't feel small anymore. She felt seen. For years, Evelyn believed that quiet endurance was a virtue. That love meant loyalty, and loyalty meant staying. Even when it hurt. But as she scrolled through thousands of supportive comments, something inside her finally began to shift. Messages poured in from women all over the country. Teachers, nurses, single mothers, widows. Strangers who saw themselves in her story. Some shared tales of their own sacrifices. Others simply wrote, "Thank you." She was no longer invisible. For the first time in her life, Evelyn felt like her pain meant something. That maybe, just maybe, she hadn't wasted her life, but paved a path for others who were still trapped. The change wasn't instant. It started small. She removed the wedding portrait from her hallway. She deleted Benjamin's contact from her phone. She stopped cooking for one and started eating what she liked. Spicy food, fresh greens, pastries with too much cream. She signed up for a pottery class at the community center. The first day, her hands fumbled awkwardly around the clay. Her instructor, a kind woman named Gloria, smiled and said, "Let it wobble. That's where the soul comes in." And Evelyn laughed, not the polite, practiced chuckle she had perfected over decades of dinner parties, but a real, belly-deep laugh that surprised even her. She began walking every morning. Not to lose weight, or to look young again. But to breathe. To feel the world move around her. To exist outside of someone else's shadow. One afternoon, she sat under the maple tree, in her backyard with a notebook in her lap. For years, Benjamin had mocked her lack of education. Had said things like, "You wouldn't understand the books I read." Or, "Why don't you try something simple, like crossword puzzles?" But now, Evelyn began to write. Not for publication. Not for revenge. Just for herself. Her first entry started like this: "I gave up my dreams once for someone who promised me the world. But today, I start dreaming again. Not because I'm young, but because I still have time. The house felt different now. Not empty. Free. She reconnected with two old friends from church, Marlene and Joyce. They met for brunch one Saturday. And as Evelyn recounted everything that had happened, they didn't gasp or pity her. They raised their mimosas and said, "About damn time." Together, they planned a trip. A real one. Spain, Italy, maybe even Greece. It had been on Evelyn's bucket list since she was 23. For the first time in her 70s, Evelyn looked in the mirror and saw more than a woman betrayed. She saw a woman becoming, not a wife, not a shadow, not just a housewife, but Evelyn Matthews, resilient, radiant, and rewriting her story, one brave page at a time. The flight to Barcelona was bumpy, but Evelyn didn't mind. She kept her hand firmly around the leather strap of her tote bag, inside which was a travel journal, a brand new camera, and a passport that had barely seen the light of day in decades. She was doing it. At 72 years old, she was flying to Europe. Marlene and Joyce were already chatting animatedly 2 rows ahead, arguing over whether they should try flamenco dancing or take a cooking class first. Evelyn sat quietly by the window, watching the clouds roll past like soft mountains. The last time she'd been on a plane was with Benjamin and Hannah, when Hannah was in college. That trip had been planned entirely around Benjamin's research itinerary. Evelyn had spent most of it sitting in hotel lobbies, waiting for lectures to end. This time was different. This time was hers. They landed in Spain under a golden sun. The streets of Barcelona were alive with energy. Music echoing from narrow alleys, locals laughing over wine and tapas, the scent of citrus and sea in the air. Evelyn wore a soft linen dress and a wide sun hat, her silver hair glowing in the evening light. She didn't look like a woman betrayed anymore. She looked like someone reborn. Their days were filled with exploration in Seville. They wandered through gardens once walked by queens. In Florence, Evelyn stood in front of Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, breathless. In Santorini, she laughed so hard over a clumsy spill of tzatziki on her blouse that a stranger offered to buy her another. And she accepted. For the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to be seen. Not as someone's mother, wife, or caretaker, but as herself. And in doing so, something miraculous happened. People noticed. The waiter in Rome who complimented her smile. The group of artists in Nice who asked her to pose for a watercolor sketch. The older gentleman in Lisbon, who danced with her on a cobbled plaza under string lights and moonlight. His name was André, a retired architect with laugh lines as deep as canyons and a voice like velvet. They talked for hours that night, about books, gardens, lost dreams, and second chances. "You have such a gentle strength," he told her. No one had ever said that to Evelyn before. But it didn't surprise her. She knew it now too. By the end of the trip, Evelyn didn't feel like she had escaped her life. She felt like she had reclaimed it. With each city, each moment, each laugh, she was piecing herself back together. Not the woman Benjamin had erased. Not the mother Hannah had dismissed. But Evelyn. The woman who dared to start over when the world told her it was too late. And she was just getting started. When Evelyn returned from Europe, the fall air in Vermont felt different. Crisp, light, filled with promise. The same streets she had once walked with her head down, now welcomed her like an old friend. The same porch where she used to wait for Benjamin's car, now held only quiet, peaceful stillness. She wasn't sad. She was free. She unpacked her suitcase and left it empty. A symbol of how she'd finally let go of all the baggage she'd once carried, the clothes she had bought overseas. Bold colors, flowing fabrics, scarves in deep wine and ocean blue, filled her closet like declarations. Evelyn had stopped dressing for invisibility. One afternoon, she stood in front of her mirror, put on red lipstick, and didn't flinch. For the first time in her life, she liked what she saw. Every Sunday, she hosted brunch in her backyard for a small group of women. Friends she'd made during her trip, and some from the local senior center. They came with homemade jam, fresh stories, and hearts wide open. They called themselves the Second Bloom Club. They didn't talk about regrets. They talked about what's next. The group gave Evelyn more than laughter. They gave her purpose. Together, they started volunteering at a literacy program for adult women. Evelyn, once mocked for her lack of education, now helped other women learn to read. I thought I wasn't smart enough, one woman said. Evelyn smiled gently. Smart isn't about where you start. It's about choosing to keep going. In the evenings, she often walked to a local ballroom, where community dance nights were held. One night, as a soft jazz tune played, a familiar hand reached for hers. It was Andre. He had made good on his promise to visit. With a warm smile and a bouquet of lavender in his hand, he asked, "May I have this dance?" And Evelyn said yes. As they moved together, under the golden light of the chandeliers, she felt something rare. Not the desperate kind of love she once clung to with Benjamin, but something gentler. A love that didn't need to prove itself. A love that met her exactly where she was. There were no grand declarations, no illusions of fairy tales. Just two people, older but not finished, sharing a quiet chapter together. One evening, as she stood on the deck of her home watching the sky turn a soft lilac hue, Evelyn realized something profound. She had grown. Not in spite of her age but because of it. She had survived abandonment. She had faced humiliation, and she had built something beautiful from the ashes. Evelyn Matthews was no longer the woman behind the man. She was her own story now. Fierce, kind, wise, and wholly alive. And the best part, she still had chapters left to write. 1 year later, Evelyn stood on the stage of a local women's empowerment event, holding a small note card in her hand. Her hair was pinned in soft waves. Her posture tall. Eyes glowing not with vengeance, but with clarity. She hadn't planned on becoming a speaker. But word of her story had spread. Not as gossip, but as inspiration. The woman who reclaimed her life at 72. The local newspaper had called her. Invitations came pouring in. Book clubs, wellness retreats, senior centers. People wanted to hear not just what had happened to her, but what she had done with it. Everyone told me it was too late to start over. She told the audience. But I've learned something. The only expiration date on reinvention is the one you believe in. The room was silent, hanging on every word. Who was a wife, a mother, a woman who spent most of her life trying not to take up too much space. I thought being quiet meant being kind. I thought love meant sacrifice. But what I've come to understand is this: loving others doesn't mean abandoning yourself. She looked out at the rows of women, young and old. Leaving my marriage wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of it. I didn't just lose a husband. I gained myself, and let me tell you, she's a woman worth knowing. Thunderous applause erupted, and Evelyn smiled. Not out of pride, but out of peace. Back home, her little countryside bistro thrived. The Second Bloom Garden Cafe had become more than a restaurant. It was a sanctuary. Women from all walks of life came not just for the farm-fresh meals, but for the warmth that seemed to radiate from every corner. They sat on the wraparound porch with tea, watched the chickens peck around the garden, and shared stories of love, of loss, of resilience. And sometimes, Evelyn would sit with them, apron dusted with flour, hands still warm from kneading bread, and listen, not as a host, but as a sister. As for Hannah, she never apologized. But one day, she showed up unannounced, standing in the same kitchen she had once dismissed. She didn't speak right away, just looked around at the jars of homemade jam, the sunlight pouring in, the laughter from outside. "This is nice," she finally said. Evelyn only smiled. Some bridges burned, some rebuilt, but Evelyn no longer needed anyone's approval to feel whole. She had traveled the world, rediscovered joy, helped others find their strength. And she had done it all at an age when society told her to stay quiet, stay small. Evelyn Matthews had proven them wrong. With grace, grit, and a red lipstick smile, her story wasn't a cautionary tale. It was a call to action. And for anyone still doubting if they were too old, too late, or too broken, Evelyn had one thing to say. You're not done. You're just beginning. Evelyn's journey teaches us that self-worth doesn't expire with age. It evolves. For too long she lived in the background, believing her sacrifices were love, that her silence was strength. But love without respect is a cage, and silence in the face of betrayal is surrender. Her story is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to choose yourself. Reinvention is not a luxury reserved for the young. It's a right that belongs to anyone brave enough to reclaim it. Whether you're 17 or 70, you deserve joy, dignity, and the freedom to start over. And perhaps most importantly, Evelyn shows us that walking away doesn't mean you've lost. Sometimes, walking away is how you win. If you've spent your life putting others first, now is the time to pause and ask, what do I want? Start small. Sign up for a class. Take that solo trip. Change the furniture in your home. Make new friends. You don't need permission to live boldly. Especially not from those who've taken you for granted. Like Evelyn, your second act can be your best. It's never too late to write a new chapter. One filled with purpose, adventure, and peace. Not to prove anything, but because you deserve it.